So real quick, I want to show you some of what was happening in the early 50s in the 10-inch era. Some great Sidney Bechet stuff was happening. This is the one we've been listening to. This is Art Hodes, a guy that did Chicago, Dixieland really well. More Sidney Bechet. More Sidney Bechet. Again, George Lewis, the fantastic New Orleans player. Some of the stuff was actually licensed from European recordings and European labels. In the modern series, this is some of what Blue Note was starting to delve into, just to give you an idea. Fats Navarro, Dizzy Gillespie, which they didn't record this. This was reissued from the Vogue label, I believe, in France. Gil Mel makes 4 10-inches, I believe, maybe 3 in the 10-inch era. The great early Miles Davis recordings, which, as you can see, he's a part of his journey. Kenny Drew makes a great early session here. Wynton Kelly, which is actually, this is a Japanese 12-inch version of it, but that's also from that series. J.J. Johnson, like I said, which some of the stuff will show up on the LP series that we're going to cover here. Clifford Brown. This is Herbie Green, a trombone player. And some of the stuff in this series, and there's a lot I don't have yet, are Blakey. A lot of it's licensed from other labels. A lot of it's still them kind of searching for their identity. Almo Hope makes a couple great 10 inches here. Yoda Hip, who will show up again in the LP series. This is some West Coast stuff that they licensed out. The great Herbie Nichols makes some great stuff. Miles Davis, this actually comes out years later, I think for a record store day. 5071 was never part of the original sequence. And then of course the Mobley 10-inch, that's a Japanese 12-inch as well. So it shows you some of the work that Blue Note was already putting in the early 50s. But it also shows you that there's going to be a fairly sharp course correction coming here. Okay, how you guys doing today? I'm excited to be here. We're talking Blue Note 1500 series, and we got some fun stuff to dive into right now. Of course, the first dozen or so reissues in the 1200 series are mostly stuff from earlier sessions that Alfred needs to transition onto LP to help keep him alive. You know, it wasn't that Monk and Miles were selling great by 55, but he still knew that these were important to get out there right off the bat. J.J. Johnson was having pretty big success on Columbia in 55, 56, along with Kai Winding, so putting his J.J. Johnson stuff out made sense. Clifford Brown had just passed, so putting Clifford Brown stuff out made sense. So we got some of that stuff from his catalog, and he issues that right off the bat. And we're going to jump in right now to 1501. And this is early Miles stuff from 52. Some of it's from 54. Again, it was all on 10-inch initially. There's some great sidemen on these records. J.J. Johnson, Jimmy Heath, Art Blakey, Percy Heath, Jackie McLean, Kenny Clark, Oscar Pettiford, Horace Silver. So there's a lot of pretty important names showing up right off the bat here for these Miles sessions. And this is volume 2. Again, these are 1501 and 1502, and those were culled from those 10 inches from the early 50s. Next came Blue Note Blood Powell, volume 1 and 2. Again, this is from earlier recordings when Powell was a very young and a very dexterous player. And the older, a bit more slower and blockier Monk-influenced Powell was partly because of his mental issues. He was having breakdowns, he'd been beat up, he'd been institutionalized. The Bud Powell story is not a very happy story by any measure of happiness. Next, followed up was J.J. Johnson. Again, these were some earlier recordings. Clifford Brown appears on some of these. Charlie Mingus is on some of these. Kenny Clark, John Lewis, Hank Mobley, Horace Silver, Clifford Brown, and Kenny Clark. Again, great early recordings by those guys. And one of the most important things to understand about Blue Note was the relationship Art Blakey had with Alfred Lyon. They were very close. It's been described as that they were brothers, separated at the hip, like they were very close. And there was a great deal of empathy and respect between the two men. And He records Blakey in '54 live at Birdland, and it comes out on the 10 inches, and we'll see it on the 12-incher eventually when they reissue it. But he can't sign Blakey right off the bat because Blakey's signed elsewhere. He's working at Columbia in '55 and '56 with Horace Silver and Donald Byrd and Hank Mobley, and all those guys will slip into the Blue Note universe as time allows. And of course, first and foremost was the transition of Horace Silver into the Blue Note universe. And he starts making some of the most important records at Blue Note. Even in the 1500 series early on, his records are important. They show you the rhythm and stride that he plays with, the groove that he's always oriented to, that really starts to define what hard bop sounds like. And on some level, you take 2 parts Horace Silver, 2 parts Art Blakey, you have the foundations of hard bop. Those 2 are the tracks that everything else in this music kind of rides along. And Clifford Brown and Max Roach are kind of really doing some fiery post bebop recordings in Chicago, you know, that would be loosely termed hard bop, but they don't seem to have quite the same emotional scale of what the Blue Note stable of hard boppers starts to do in '56 and '57. But even in '55, those roots are going to be existing. And so you hear on this fantastic Bohemia record 1 and 2 with Kenny Dorham, Art Blakey, Hank Mobley, Horace Silver, and Doug Watkins, and the number of greats that come through not just the Blue Note stable, but the Jazz Messenger, Horace Silver, Art Blakey circle is just immense. Silver, Blakey, Doug Watkins end up going their own way and becoming part of Silver's first group, and then Blakey signs a whole new crew on, and Blakey of course still isn't a Blue Note guy, so in '56 and '70s recording with all the other labels like Jubilee and Pacific and Bethlehem and a pretty Electra he makes a record for in '57, and it's not until '57 late, where '58 actually, when we switch to the 4000 series, where Blakey's Moanin' is the first actual Blakey record that comes out on Blue Note. But that circle of Blakey and Silver is omnipresent in the 1500 series going into the 4000 series. Another very important cat who records in the early 50s is Milt Jackson. Milt works with Blakey early on. He's got some Jazz Messenger credential, even though he never really is an official member. He's one of the great blues players on the vibraphone. He comes from the Detroit School of Musicians. He's just a badass. I'm a big fan of Milt Jackson. He doesn't stay with Blue Note long. He moves around all over the music industry, and of course, he's also a founding and long-term member of the Modern Jazz Quartet with John Lewis, which is where a lot of his recordings will end up being, on Atlantic with John Lewis and company. But it's really here. So it's really here, though, with these recordings that he does of Monk in '48, '52, where we see Alfred's real comprehension of what the black integral sound is going to be. And he's willing to take this incredible risk for a guy that nobody else was really taking very serious at the time. Of course, Monk goes on to write a lot of the modern jazz canon: Roundabout Midnight, Ruby My Dear, In Walked Bud, Epistrophe, Mysterioso. It's just straight no chaser. It's a lot of the most important songs in modern jazz come from the pen and the mind of young Thelonious Monk. And these records, like I said, they weren't even issued right off the bat. And it's in looking back that people see how important these Monk records truly are. And that's pretty special, if you ask me. Number 1512 is the first Jimmy Smith record, as I was telling you about. And it's a fiery young session with a young guy who had spent a year locked in a warehouse with a B. Hammond, with Thornell Schwartz on guitar, who has a nice record on Argo, by the way. It took me a while to find that, along with Donald Bailey and Bay Perry on the drums on a couple tracks. But that's Jimmy Smith's first session, and it's pretty tough to find nowadays. That leads us to 1513, and that's the great Thad Jones. Thad Jones has been a member of Basie's group now for quite a while. He's led and done a lot of the charts and arrangements in Basie's group. He's a wonderful mid-tone trumpet player who has a lot of brightness and clarity, and I think he's quite a musical theoretical guy too. He seems to really know what he's doing. This is a tough record to find. This is a Classic Records reissue, and thank goodness for Classic Records in the late 90s, early 2000s. They issued wonderful facsimiles of a lot of these early 1500 records with the lovely shellac covers and really well put together sounding recordings. Jimmy Smith's second record, often referred to as Volume 2, is A New Sound, A New Star. And again, Smith is going to start making inroads almost right away for Alfred Lion and Blue Note. Jimmy Smith is going to become a big part of the success. A big part of the success of the Blue Note sound ends up being young Jimmy Smith. As I mentioned in part 1, he almost gave in and sold the record label to Atlantic in '54 instead of making the transition to LP himself, but he held out. And from what I understand, I think it's Nat Hentoff or Michael Kuskuna, I heard say the offer from Atlantic was embarrassingly low, which probably made it a little easier for him to push off on that offer. Now, going back again to the motherland, Jutta Hipp was a pianist that they knew back home in Germany, and they brought her over and they recorded some of her work, and she's a fine player. She does some work with Zut Sims coming up as well, which I think is actually a reissue of a 10-inch series. She's a really nice player, and talk about some records that are tough to come by. This is Gil Mel's last record for Blue Note. His first 3 or 4 are on the 10-inch early 50s era. This is a great little record, Patterns in Jazz. Joe Cinderella, one of my favorite guitar players, who doesn't get a lot as a leader, but he's a great player. Oscar Pettiford's on the bass. Eddie Burt, the trombonist, is on here from Savoy, a fantastic player, and Ed Thigpen's on the drums. And of course, Ed ends up in Europe for a long time. This is Horace Silver's first record as a leader, and this has in the 12-inch era. This has Kenny Dorham, Hank Mobley, Horace Silver, Doug Watkins, and Art Blakey. And so it's not far from a Jazz Messenger lineup. In fact, it's still billed as Horace Silver and his Jazz Messengers, in part because Blakey's contract is assigned elsewhere. And Silver and Blakey are going to go their separate ways and do different separate groups, but they never really. I never heard of them having a falling out. It was just more about, we can spread this music faster if we both lead our own groups. And possibly Blakey's heroin problem was a problem for Silver, because I know Blakey was a pretty difficult addict and very governed by it. And I've not heard the same about Silver. And so drugs can always be an X factor in any relationship dynamic. Make no question about that. The great Herbie Nichols, a guy who hung around with Monk and Powell and has elements of their playing, but they also spent time around Herbie Nichols and his playing, and it's hard to me to believe that they didn't all cross-germinate each other and make some impact on each other's playing. This is 1519, and certainly a tough record to come by. That's some of that rhythm and blues boogie of Horace Silver right there. It just chugs along, and Blakey's driving it. Watkins is throwing it down. I wish we had gotten more from young Doug Watkins. He definitely passed way too early. This is a record from 1520. Horace Silver again with the same image. Cebu joins the mix, and it's got Gene Ramey, Curly Russell, Percy Heath. It's more of a trio session with the percussion laid on top of it. A fine record, tough to come by. 1521 and 1522 are two of my favorite Blue Note records ever. This one was again a gift from my friend Ahmad. Thank you again, Armand. I appreciate it. This was the first rendition of the covers This is the Birdland stuff that was already on 10-inch in 53 and 54, but they reissue it here again because they didn't have Blakey's name to issue as a leader yet. And so this is with Clifford Brown, Lou Donaldson, Horace Silver, and Curly Russell, and very famous live session. And that record cooks, but the both of them cook. This is the second cover that those were issued with, and these are fantastic. Reed Miles design, beautiful. I love the layout of these, just gorgeous. But it's the same 1521 and 1522. 1523 is Kenny Burrell's first record as a leader on Blue Note. He makes probably 3 or 4 in this sequence. I'm a huge Kenny Burrell fan. I probably have about 60 of his records. Truly a beautiful player that can play in any setting. When you get Grant Green, who I love, he's going to be very much in that R&B, gospel, and blues vein. That's what Grant Green does. You can put Kenny Burrell in any setting, and you'll hear some wonderful, beautiful playing that's completely applicable to the setting that it's in. He's one of the most unique and beautiful, breathy players in the jazz canon. Kenny Dorham, he's going to be short-lived in Horace Silver's group and the Messengers, and he's going to start going on his own. Dorham's legacy is a bit mixed, in part because he moves around from label to label a lot. Unlike some of the cats who stay with Blue Note forever, he goes to ABC, makes a great record there. He spends some time at the Time record label. He does some stuff at Prestige New Jazz. So he shifts around quite a lot. I kind of wish he'd stayed more at Blue Note and worked with those cats, but I'm not privy to knowing why. Was he not offered a contract? Was he just offered better contracts elsewhere? Those things are always tough to really vent out. This is Jimmy Smith's Volume 3, technically 1525. And by this time, Smith's star is really starting to ascend, and his impact is pretty much unquestioned in terms of his velocity and how much of a sales force he's going to be for the label. In 1526 is the great Clifford Brown, which is a memorial album which reissues some earlier material from the 10-inch era, because of course he passes away in the summer of 56, and what a great loss that was for the jazz world. And so Blue Note honors him by putting out some of the material that they'd already done with him, and he's the greatest virtuoso in jazz. And there's other claimants to that throne, including Hubbard and Armstrong on trumpet, but for my money, Clifford Brown does things that require magic to do. His tonality, his rhythmic ability, his breath, his embouchure, it's all so dead on center all the time. Thad Jones' second volume here, one of my favorite covers on the Blue Note canon. This is number 1527. He's playing with some great young stallions here. Billy Mitchell, again, a fantastic cat on the tenor. Barry Harris, another Detroit cat. Percy Heath, and Max Roach. So there's some Roach for you. He doesn't make any records as a leader, Max, but he's certainly at the Blue Note stable on plenty of recordings. And then rounding out number 28 and 29, 2 more Jimmy Smith sessions. These are at Club Baby Grand in Wilmington, Delaware. And again, you hear the fire and ferocity of one of the great players and virtuosos in jazz, again with Thornell Schwartz and Don Bailey. And shortly after this is when we changed to Eddie McFadden as his rhythm guitar player. But Thornell and McFadden both do great stuff behind Jimmy Smith. This is the aforementioned Yuta Hip. This is the record she did with Zoot Sims. Now, if I recall, this is the one that's reissued from the 12-inch, the 10-inch, sorry, but I'm not even positive on that. My mind's a sieve at times. Hank Mobley with Bird and Morgan, 1540. Wrong record, sorry. 1531 and 32 are these Fats Navarro sessions. And again, Fats has passed 5 years prior to this. So this is some of the last stuff Blue Note puts out from its pre-LP era. Savoy continues to do it for another 3-4 years. Blue Note's kind of done with it right about there. There might be 1 or 2 more, but this is the arrival of Johnny Griffin in New York. He comes from Chicago. He's a ferocious player. He plays with incredible dexterity, just dynamic, fast, and fluent. One of the most virtuoistic players of the tenor saxophone. Griffin's on fire. I love his work later on with Eddie Lockjaw Davis, which is a bit more barbecue blues and throwdown. His stuff here at Blue Note, when he arrives, they really do some charged stuff. This record is absolutely ferocious. It features Wynton Kelly, Curly Russell, and Max Roach, and they lay down some thunder on that. 15434 is one of my favorite records on Blue Note. Great album cover. It's great. Paul Chambers, his first record as a leader. This features Donald Byrd, John Coltrane, Kenny Burrell, Horace Silver, and Philly Joe Jones. So again, just an incredibly wonderful record. Chambers gets to really branch out. He does some bowing, some plucking. He's just a really excellent player that's on so much of the Blue Note canon, as well as Prestige, Riverside, and jazz period. You know, from 1954 to 1960, Paul Chambers is everywhere. Afro-Cuban Kenny Dorham. I believe this is a 10-inch first, this one. So this is a second cover and reissue of some early material. And J.R. Montrose, a great player. He makes a couple other great records on Jarro and other labels. This is his lone Blue Note, and it's the last record that Blue Note will do of a white guy during the Alfred Lion years, which is pretty crazy because we're talking 300 records. Lou Donaldson shows up here, and again, he's got some stuff on 10-inch era, and this is stuff culled from the 10-inch era. Some great players are on this session. If I recall, it's got Horace Silver, Gene Ramey, Art Taylor, Billy Mitchell, Percy Heath, Kenny Dorham, Matthew Gee. So some great players are on those sessions. 1538 is Lee Morgan's arrival. Lee Morgan indeed. And Lee Morgan is going to be one of the guys that really helps to change the course of Blue Note. And then Horace Silver, 1539, 6 pieces of silver, a clever play on his name. This is a nice old pressing. You can see the ear right there. You can see the RVG. You can see all the little details that make it an original first pressing. Horace Silver deserves so much more recognition than the modern day collector gives him. He's that important. He's that a part of this puzzle. And why he's so overlooked, I'm not really sure. 1540 again is the great Mobley, Donald Byrd, and Lee Morgan. And these three guys, I call them the law firm of Morgan, Mobley, and Byrd. And they are the foundation of the Blue Note stable for the next 3-4 years. They all have jazz messenger pedigree. They all play, especially with each other, at a ferocious tempo. It's resistance, fist up in the air music. There's a power to it that is hard to deny. And they're all kind of still finding their voice at that point in some ways, but there's still a real urgency to that record. It may not be one of the best Blue Notes, but there's an urgency there that kind of sets the tone for what's to come. And Blue Note in general is starting to find its way. They're still doing some of the New Orleans sound, but they're not putting it in this series at all. It's got its own series. And for the most part, Alfred was dedicated to the integrity of what these young black men wanted to say, and he gave them all a license to say whatever was on their mind. And the documentation from this point forward of the Blue Note sound, especially up until about 1960-61, it's just an incredibly potent concoction of sound and velocity and the human experience and my condition within this environment. It's powerful stuff. Morgan, 1541, with a guy by the name of Kenny Rogers, not the country player. Horace Silver, Charlie Person, and Paul Chambers. Another fantastic classic record reissue. This is Rollins' first Blue Note, 1542. Rollins makes a total of 4 records of Blue Note, and Rollins also jumps around a lot, and he probably would have benefited from being at Blue Note longer. His Prestige stuff's great, and Saxophone Colossus is absolutely fantastic, but had he stayed at Blue Note, maybe not gone to Contemporary, and even the stuff at RCA, I love the bridge, but I think he'd be doing a more potent, aggressive style had he stayed with the Blue Note guys. 1543 is another Kenny Burrell and Andy Warhol cover. I love anything Kenny Burrellis, like I said. 1544 is Hank Mobley and his All-Stars. Again, it's going to be mostly the same cats blowing and throwing down that thunder. Milt Jackson's on this one, Horace Silver with Doug Watkins and Art Blakey. So again, that whole stable of cats kind of existing. Lou Donaldson, Wailing with Lou. And I think this one might also have some earlier recordings on it, if I recall. Although this one might be the one that's all in... No, it's got Lou Donaldson, Peck Morrison, Herman Foster, who's a great piano player. People don't pay much attention to Herman Foster. But again, a guy who has some records at Argo. Thad Jones, this is his last record at Blue Note. Another fantastic session. And I'm going to look at who's the band on this again. With Benny Powell from Basie's group, Gigi Grice, Elvin Jones, George Vivier, and Tommy Flanagan. And then Barry Harris, Percy Heath, and Max Roach on one of the songs together. Jimmy Smith, again, 2 double live record. This has now Eddie McFadden with Mobley, Bird, and Donaldson, along with Art Blakey. So there's some thunder right there. You got Blakey laying down the thunder. Jimmy Smith is playing the bass with his feet and the incredible bebop organ. And you have the horn section of Donald Byrd, Lou Donaldson, and Hank Mobley, and Eddie McFadden playing that rhythm guitar. These are great records that really have some thunder to them. And then 1549 is Clifford Jordan and John Gilmore, 2 more cats from the Chicago sound and the Chicago scene that blow into New York and can't wait to lick their chops to have a chance to record that Blue Note. Because what a legacy it is. We'll get to the rest of it in part 3. Y'all be safe. Peace.